The Narcosian Supreme War Council gathered in the Grand Chamber of the Imperial War Fortress, an immense obsidian structure floating ominously above the crimson clouds of Zarkan Prime. Inside, under the glow of flickering war banners and holographic displays, the most fearsome minds of the Empire convened to discuss what would become the most significant military campaign in their species' long and bloody history: the conquest of Earth. Seated at the head of the obsidian table, Supreme Commander Gorlax, the Annihilator, exuded an air of absolute authority. His battle-hardened exoskeleton bore scars from centuries of victorious campaigns, and his deep-set eyes shimmered with anticipation. He had led the Narcosian war machine to conquer dozens of worlds, crushing rebellions and annihilating lesser species with ruthless efficiency. To him, this latest conquest was another inevitable triumph, a mere formality in the Empire's march to total galactic dominance. Beside him, General Krolvag, his most ambitious warlord, leaned forward, his mandibles twitching in excitement. "The intelligence reports are clear, Supreme Commander," Krolvag declared, tapping his claw against a shimmering projection of Earth. "The species known as humans are primitive. No unified planetary government, no interstellar fleet, no energy shields. They still rely on projectile-based weaponry, combustion-driven vehicles, and, if you can believe it, manual labor. They are stuck in an era of technological infancy. Their submission is assured." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Narcosian warlords, towering and adorned in ceremonial battle armor, exchanged confident glances. Conquering weak planets was nothing new to them. What set this campaign apart was its sheer absurdity. For the first time in centuries, they were about to invade a species that had not even made contact with the wider galaxy. A conquest so lopsided, so embarrassingly simple, that it would surely cement Gorlax's name in the annals of history. Gorlax steepled his fingers and exhaled through his ridged nostrils. "Explain to me, then, why this world has not already been conquered." His voice was a slow, deliberate growl, the kind that could silence an entire war council. Krolvag hesitated, only for a moment, before continuing. "The peculiar nature of human civilization complicates our approach. Unlike most lesser species, they are not united. They war against each other constantly, dividing themselves into arbitrary factions based on location, ideology, or even appearance. Their history is a bloodbath of internal conflict. While this means they will be weaker as a whole, it also makes predicting their response difficult. They may not even recognize our arrival as an invasion." One of the elder warlords scoffed. "What kind of species cannot recognize an invasion?" Krolvag gave a slight shrug. "Our intelligence division has intercepted their communications. We have uncovered texts and transmissions suggesting that humans often depict imaginary alien invasions in their entertainment. In fact, they seem to find the concept amusing. There is a distinct possibility that when our fleet descends, they will assume it is some kind of theatrical performance." He gestured toward a shifting montage of images, grainy clips of explosions, laser battles, and strangely costumed humans wielding primitive weapons. Gorlax frowned. "This is their military?" "No, Supreme Commander," Krolvag corrected, his tone laced with mild irritation. "This is their fiction. Their actual military forces are less impressive." He brought up a new display, featuring crude images of various human war machines. They rely heavily on ballistic weapons, armored vehicles, and aircraft that still require oxygen-based combustion. Their warships do not possess energy shielding. Even their most devastating weapon, a thermonuclear device, is laughably inefficient compared to our planetary siege cannons. Gorlax exhaled sharply, his version of a derisive chuckle. "Then we are wasting time with this discussion. Deploy the fleet and issue terms of surrender. If they resist, annihilate their command centers and seize control of their infrastructure. The only reason to invade such a world is to exploit its natural resources, correct?" Krolvag nodded. "Indeed. Their world is rich in rare metals, abundant in liquid water, and most importantly, positioned in a sector that would give us prime strategic dominance over neighboring empires." Gorlax leaned back in his throne-like seat, the decision already made in his mind. Then we proceed. Our forces will descend in 3 waves. First, we will establish planetary dominance through a series of targeted strikes against their military strongholds. Second, we will deploy ground troops to instill fear and assert direct control over their largest population centers. And third, we will install a provisional government composed of cooperative local rulers, assuming any of them possess the intelligence to submit willingly. He turned toward Krolvag, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. You will lead the first wave. Krolvag straightened, his mandibles twitching with excitement. An honor supreme commander. A ripple of approval moved through the gathered warlords. The campaign was set. The fleet, already in formation, awaited only the command to warp into the human system and descend upon Earth like an unstoppable tide. As the council dispersed, Krolvag remained behind, his thoughts racing. He activated a small hollow device on his gauntlet, bringing up one last intercepted human transmission. The flickering image of a man with square-framed glasses and a strange, monotone voice filled the screen. The year is 1996, the voice droned. Independence Day has shattered box office records. Krolvag scowled, tilting his head. Independence from what? He shut off the device, dismissing the oddity from his mind. Soon, such trivialities would be irrelevant. In less than a solar cycle, Earth would belong to the Narcosian Empire. And yet, as he strode toward the war docks, he could not shake a peculiar unease gnawing at the back of his mind. General Jack O'Reilly sat in the Pentagon's command center, feet up on the table, flipping through a dog-eared issue of Popular Mechanics, while sipping what had to be his 4th cup of coffee that morning. The overhead lights buzzed softly, the air conditioning hummed, and all around him, analysts and military personnel went about their business with the casual efficiency of people who had seen just about everything. A young officer rushed in, slightly out of breath, clutching a thick manila folder. Sir, urgent intelligence briefing. O'Reilly barely glanced up. Let me guess. China's hacking our satellites again? Or is this about the Russians getting sassy in the Arctic? Neither, sir. The officer gulped. It's aliens. O'Reilly set his magazine down slowly. He squinted at the officer, as if trying to detect sarcasm. Son, I haven't even finished my coffee yet. Say that again. The officer placed the folder on the table and slid a grainy image in front of him. It was a satellite capture of an enormous fleet of ships, bristling with weaponry, descending toward Earth's orbit. O'Reilly picked up the photo, studied it, then leaned back in his chair. Huh. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir. Huh. O'Reilly repeated, setting the photo back down. He rubbed his temples. All right, I'll bite. What do they want? The officer pulled out another document. They've issued a demand for surrender. It was intercepted through our deep space monitoring stations. The message claims they are the Narcosian Empire and that humanity must submit to their rule immediately or face annihilation. O'Reilly sighed deeply, then reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. And what's the White House's official response? The officer hesitated. The president thinks it's a hoax. Something about an elaborate Super Bowl stunt. O'Reilly pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course he does. Another officer from the other side of the room called out. Sir, we just received another transmission. They're broadcasting their surrender ultimatum again, except they seem to have accidentally hacked into a cable network. O'Reilly turned. Which network? ESPN. A beat of silence. Well shit. O'Reilly sighed. Half the country's gonna think this is a weird halftime show. Just then, a new voice cut through the chatter. Sir, we got strange activity in Nebraska. O'Reilly turned his head slowly, skeptical. Nebraska. The analyst nodded. We picked up reports of strange ships landing outside a cornfield near Grand Island. Local authorities think it's either a government experiment or some kind of bizarre Hollywood stunt. O'Reilly frowned. You're telling me an alien invasion has started in Nebraska? The analyst adjusted his glasses. Yes, sir. O'Reilly shook his head, drained the last of his coffee, and stood up. All right. Enough of this nonsense. Scramble a reconnaissance team, get a live feed, and someone get me the damn governor of Nebraska on the phone. Meanwhile, deep in the Nebraska cornfields, old Earl Jenkins stood in his overalls, chewing on a toothpick, shotgun resting casually over his shoulder. The sky was ablaze with alien ships, towering, sleek constructs humming with eerie green light. The massive central craft hovered like some angry storm cloud, kicking up dust as it settled just outside the fence of Earl's property. A hatch hissed open, and out marched a squad of towering, insectoid warriors clad in armor. They stopped a few yards from Earl, standing stiffly as their apparent leader, a particularly smug-looking alien, stepped forward and spoke in a deep, guttural voice. "Primitive biped," the alien declared. "You stand before General Krolvag of the Narcosian Empire. Your people will submit to our rule or be eradicated." Earl spat into the dirt. He adjusted his cap. Then he scratched his chin and said, "Y'all with the government?" Krolvag blinked, confused. "What?" Earl squinted at him. "You one of them secret projects out of Area 51? Some kind of military thing? 'Cause I told them boys last time I ain't selling my land, no matter how many fancy tricks they pull." Krolvag's mandibles twitched. "This is not a negotiation. This is your conquest. You will kneel before the might of the—" Boom. Earl casually lowered his shotgun, smoke still trailing from the barrel. Krolvag howled in pain, clutching his foot where the buckshot had shredded his ornate boots. His warriors recoiled in shock, their weapons snapping into ready positions. Earl racked another shell. "I dunno what kind of Halloween costume y'all are wearing, but if you come onto my land talking about conquest again, we're gonna have a real problem." Panic set in among the Narcosian troops. One of them frantically tapped on a wrist communicator, sending an emergency report back to the command ship. The message was urgent and simple. They have superior weapons. Reinforcements required. Back in the Pentagon, O'Reilly watched the live footage streaming in from military drones. His cigarette hung loosely from his lips as he observed the supposed supreme warriors of the galaxy flailing in disarray because one old farmer had shot their leader in the foot. He exhaled slowly. "Well, I'll be damned." Another officer approached, wide-eyed. "Sir, the National Guard is moving in. Local police, too. They still think it's some kind of experimental drill." O'Reilly grinned. "Good. Let's keep it that way for now." The alien forces had expected an overwhelming show of force, but what they got instead was chaos. Instead of a unified military resistance, they found themselves besieged by bewildered but heavily armed humans who seemed to have no idea they were supposed to be losing. A squad of Nebraska state troopers arrived on scene, their lights flashing as they approached the alien war machines. One officer rolled down his window. "Hey, fellas, you got a permit for all this?" The aliens, unable to process the absurdity of the question, hesitated. That hesitation was all it took. The first National Guard helicopters roared overhead. On the ground, armored vehicles rumbled into position. Civilians gathered at a distance, taking pictures, some assuming it was the world's most elaborate movie set. O'Reilly turned to his communications officer. "Get me the Joint Chiefs. Then get me the President. I want a full mobilization order ready to go. If these bug-eyed bastards want to fight, we're giving them one." The officer hesitated. "Sir, does this mean we're officially at war?" O'Reilly picked up his mug, took a long sip, and grinned. "Hell, I don't know. But we're sure as hell joining it." General Jack O'Reilly stood with arms crossed in the Pentagon's war room, watching a live feed from Nebraska as chaos unfolded. The Narcosian ground forces, elite warriors of the so-called greatest empire in the galaxy, had scattered like spooked cattle the moment they realized humans weren't following their carefully scripted plan for planetary domination. What had started as a grand conquest had turned into something closer to a cosmic slapstick routine. A fleet of alien warships hovered menacingly in Earth's atmosphere, their weapons primed to strike, but on the ground, things were going poorly. The first encounter in the cornfields had spiraled into complete disarray. The aliens trained in meticulous tactical formations, had expected humans to either surrender or engage in regimented battle formations like every other species they'd conquered. Instead, they faced a whirlwind of unexpected, chaotic violence. The National Guard had arrived first, still under the impression that they were dealing with a rogue military experiment or a particularly ambitious hoax. They opened fire on the invaders out of sheer reflex, and when the aliens returned fire, the Guard responded the only way they knew how, by escalating. The first helicopter strafed the alien landing site, sending a barrage of bullets through their ranks. The Narcosians had shields designed to resist directed energy weapons, plasma fire, and advanced ballistics. Unfortunately, they had never accounted for the sheer, brute force simplicity of a rotary cannon dumping thousands of rounds per minute. As the first wave of alien troops fell in sprays of iridescent blood, confusion spread through the enemy ranks. Their communications channels flooded with panicked messages. These humans weren't behaving like a species being conquered. They weren't negotiating, they weren't pleading, they weren't even coordinating their forces properly. They were just attacking, ruthlessly, without any concern for what was supposed to happen. A Narcosian officer frantically reported back to his fleet commander. They have projectile-based weapons, and they just keep firing them. His voice trembled. They are using kinetic-based aerial machines that make a horrific sound. The transmission cut out, replaced by the unmistakable, dreadful roar of an A-10 Warthog, delivering its signature brrrr. It was the last thing he ever heard. Above the battlefield, the situation grew worse. The Narcosian command ship had prepared for a conventional planetary assault, expecting to dominate the airspace uncontested. They had superior energy weapons, highly advanced targeting systems, and impenetrable armor plating, impenetrable against any civilized adversary. That is, unfortunately, the moment the U.S. Air Force scrambled its first squadron of F-22 Raptors and B-2 bombers, the aliens learned a hard lesson. Human warfare was not civilized. The first wave of Earth's counterattack was surgical. Jets weaved through the sky, dodging alien plasma blasts with ease, and unleashed a torrent of missiles at the hovering warships. The Narcosians, having dismissed the idea that anything as crude as guided explosives could pose a threat, didn't even bother activating their full defenses. The mistake was catastrophic. The first direct hit sent one of the smaller Narcosian frigates into a violent tailspin. Another explosion took out a shield generator on a larger cruiser, leaving it vulnerable for a well-placed follow-up strike. Within moments, the entire fleet was scrambling to reposition, abandoning their planned invasion formations in a desperate bid for survival. In the Pentagon, O'Reilly lit a cigar as he watched the feeds rolling in. Jesus Christ, we're not even trying yet. The analysts around him exchanged nervous glances. The situation was progressing so rapidly that their strategic models couldn't keep up. Every projection had assumed that a full-scale war would take weeks, if not months, with humanity barely scraping by through guerrilla tactics and asymmetric warfare. Instead, the aliens were collapsing under the sheer weight of raw, unfiltered human aggression. On the ground, it only got worse. Civilians, realizing an alien invasion was unfolding right in their backyard, did what any rational species would do when confronted with extraterrestrial conquest. They grabbed their guns. In Texas, entire militia groups mobilized within hours, treating the invasion like the world's most serious hunting trip. Pickup trucks mounted with .50 caliber machine guns tore across highways toward landing zones, their occupants whooping and hollering as they fired at anything with too many legs. In Michigan, an entire biker gang, mistaking the invasion for some kind of dystopian government crackdown, rode straight into an alien patrol and wiped them out using little more than sawed-off shotguns and an unstoppable sense of patriotic outrage. And in Florida, well, Florida was a disaster for entirely different reasons. Reports came in of a shirtless man wrestling an alien soldier into submission before stealing his plasma rifle and using it to hold up a gas station for beer. Another report detailed a group of retirees from a golf club taking down a scout ship using nothing but a well-placed propane explosion and a suspiciously large cache of dynamite. O'Reilly watched in astonishment as footage poured in from across the country. He turned to his intelligence officer. "How's the rest of the world responding?" The officer checked his screens. "Russia has mobilized. But honestly, sir, they seem mostly irritated that they weren't the first to shoot something down. China's scrambling jets. But at this rate, they won't get a chance to engage before it's over. Europe's mostly drinking wine and watching the carnage on the news." He paused. "And, Australia deployed a special forces unit that immediately got into a fistfight with an alien warlord. No weapons, just fists." O'Reilly chuckled. "I love this planet." The Narcosian High Command had seen enough. Aboard the central warship, Supreme Commander Gorlax's composure had cracked completely. His claws trembled as he reviewed the battlefield reports. Nothing made sense. The humans were using primitive weaponry, yet it was devastating. They had no centralized military coordination, yet their forces were overwhelming. And, most terrifying of all, they enjoyed this. Krolvag, his foot still bandaged from a close encounter with a shotgun blast, staggered into the command chamber. "We have to retreat," he wheezed. "These creatures, they are chaos incarnate." Gorlax stared at him. "We are the greatest military force in the galaxy. We do not retreat." They blew up an entire landing zone using beer and propane. Supreme Commander. Krolvag's mandibles quivered. "They drop explosives from the sky with reckless abandon. They fight with joy." Gorlax's claws clenched. The weight of reality crashed down on him. This war, their grand conquest, had lasted mere hours before spiraling into an unmitigated disaster. He had no choice. His voice, heavy with resignation, transmitted the final command. "All forces retreat." The transmission echoed across the fleet. Narcosian warships, battered and smoking, turned and fled, abandoning entire battalions still stranded on Earth. As the last of the alien vessels vanished into the cold vacuum of space, O'Reilly exhaled a long plume of smoke and turned to his officers. "Somebody get me a beer." The Narcosian fleet limped back into deep space, battered, humiliated, and reeling from what could only be described as the most catastrophic military blunder in recorded galactic history. The great and terrible war machine of the Empire, forged through centuries of conquest, had crumbled in mere hours, brought to ruin not by superior technology, not by intricate tactics, but by an enemy that simply refused to play by the rules of civilized warfare. In the vast shadowed halls of the Imperial War Fortress, Supreme Commander Gorlax, the Annihilator, stood before the Grand Council of Zarkan Prime, his once imposing figure hunched beneath the weight of failure. The council chamber, usually a place of solemn strategic debate, was now filled with barely contained laughter. Murmurs of disbelief echoed across the great domed room, punctuated by the occasional scoff or outright guffaw. Gorlax had never before felt the sting of shame, and yet now it gripped him like a vice. "The mighty Narcosian Empire," one of the elder counselors said, rubbing his temple, "laid low in less than a solar cycle by a race that still uses fossil fuels. They weaponize beer, Supreme Commander." Another counselor waved a data pad. "Beer. Do you understand how absurd that is? One of our landing sites was destroyed because a human mixed alcohol with a crude combustion device and threw it at a munitions cache." Another stood up, exasperated. "We lost 2 capital ships because their flying machines do not rely on energy-based propulsion. Our targeting systems could not even calculate how to intercept them." Gorlax clenched his jaw. "Our intelligence was insufficient." Insufficient. The elder counselor leaned forward. "Supreme Commander, our intelligence reports suggested they were a primitive species, that they were divided, that they had no planetary defenses worth considering. And yet, within hours of your grand invasion, they had turned our troops into a spectacle for their amusement." Another counselor tapped his claws against the table, sighing deeply. "Do you know that a video of your ground forces being overrun by something called Florida Man has already become the most watched transmission on the galactic web?" He shook his head. "One human broke into a Narcosian supply depot, subdued 3 of our elite guards, and then drove off in one of our armored vehicles while shirtless and covered in some kind of earth sauce called barbecue. Gorlax could only grit his mandibles. The council chamber filled with more reports, each more damning than the last. Apparently, a group of human farmers had captured an entire battalion of Narcosian soldiers and forced them to participate in what they called a county fair, involving bizarre trials of strength and agility. One squad of Narcosian scouts had been trapped inside a massive retail structure called a Walmart when civilians mistook them for staff and refused to let them leave until they answered questions about discount prices. Another group had been utterly demoralized after watching an Earth transmission featuring a human named Chuck Norris, whom they now mistakenly believed was the supreme warlord of the planet. The Empire's most devastating defeat had not been at the hands of a rival military. It had not been engineered through cunning strategy or overwhelming force. It had been delivered by the sheer, unfathomable chaos of an undisciplined, unpredictable species that saw war not as a solemn duty, but as an opportunity to see which of them could come up with the most absurd way to take down an alien. The Narcosian Emperor himself finally spoke, his voice low and cold. This was not a battle. This was not even a skirmish. This was a disgrace. His gaze bore into Gorlax like a plasma lance. Tell me, Supreme Commander, how do you intend to remedy the utter embarrassment you have brought upon our empire? Gorlax was silent for a long moment. There was no answer that could salvage this disaster. No redemption for the utter folly of underestimating the humans. He swallowed hard. We will not engage the humans again. The chamber erupted in shock. We cannot afford to, Gorlax continued. They are unpredictable. They do not fight as other species do. They do not follow the structure of war we understand. They are, he exhaled sharply. They are insane. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. You propose we abandon the conquest of a species that, by all logic, should be nothing more than an afterthought. With all due respect, Your Excellency, Gorlax said, logic does not apply to humans. A heavy silence settled over the council. The words were difficult to accept, but impossible to refute. The Narcosian Empire had never encountered an enemy like humanity, an enemy that had somehow managed to shatter every expectation, every known pattern of war. At last, the Emperor leaned back, steepling his claws. Then we shall not engage the humans again. His voice was final, absolute. From this moment forward, the planet known as Earth is to be classified as a galactic exclusion zone. No Narcosian vessel will enter its space. No attempt shall be made to reclaim what was lost. Gorlax exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The Emperor's next words, however, turned his relief to dread. But you, Supreme Commander, the Emperor continued, are hereby relieved of your title. You have shamed us beyond measure. You will live in exile, and you will spend the rest of your days contemplating the sheer depth of your failure. The council nodded in solemn agreement. With a heavy heart, Gorlax bowed. There was nothing left to say. He turned, walking away from the chamber, knowing that his name would forever be remembered in disgrace, not as the greatest conqueror of the Empire, but as the fool who had brought war to the one species in the galaxy that should have been left alone. Back on Earth, General Jack O'Reilly sat in his office, staring at the official reports piling up on his desk. A smirk played at the corner of his lips. The government was still scrambling to piece together how to spin the entire incident to the public. As far as he was concerned, though, there wasn't much to spin. They had won. Easily. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. O'Reilly. A voice on the other end hesitated. Sir, we have a situation. O'Reilly sighed, rubbing his temple. Please don't tell me the aliens came back. No, sir, it's just, well, the boys down in R&D were reverse engineering one of the alien plasma rifles, and some idiot gave it to a guy from Texas. O'Reilly's smirk widened. He leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigar. Well, he said, exhaling a thick plume of smoke. That's their problem now.